So for a closer look at Brazil's economy and what the new year might bring, I turn to Guy Burton. He's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics in London, and I asked him what kind of economy President-elect Bolsonaro will actually inherit.
As you're probably aware, Brazil's gone through a bit of a recession in the last few years. It went into recession back in 2014, and it seems to now be starting to come out of it. Recent estimates by organizations like the OECD have suggested that the economy is recovering and will be running at about sort of 2% growth next year and into 2020. But that is considered to be somewhat modest growth for what Brazil needs. And what it's really going to need is more substantive structural reforms.
So what kind of economic changes is he likely to try to implement in 2019?
I mean, the major one is probably going to be pension reform. This is something that his predecessor, Michel Temer, started to do in 2016, 2017, but he eventually had to give it up. Because to reform pensions in Brazil is not an easy task. It actually requires a constitutional amendment, which requires a 3/5 majority in both houses of Congress. The thing about pension reform is that this is actually one of the key things for change in Brazil. At the moment, we have around 20 million beneficiaries of pensions, and within the next 30 to 40 years, that's going to rise to about 60 million. And with the demographics not seeing a similar increase in a number of workers, that's going to put more and more pressure on Brazil. Indeed, the recent recession, we've seen the government deficit grow to about 10% of GDP. So if we're thinking about no change to pensions over the next 20 to 30 years, that could be incredibly significant, even greater.
Does he have a completely free hand, or does he have to work with other politicians?
Well, one of the reasons why Bolsonaro was elected, he was seen as a completely new broom, being very different from the past. In fact, he was very critical of the politicians on both left and right, during his campaign. As you're probably aware, Brazil, at the same time as that Brazil was going through this recession, it was also going through a big political corruption scandal. One of the things about Brazil is that in order for governments to govern, they require building a coalition within Congress. Now, that's very difficult to do because Congress is made up of a large number of political parties. And so the way that previous presidents have done this is to effectively buy votes. Bolsonaro said he was going to do things differently, that he was going to only try and build coalitions with like-minded groups on each issue as they come to Congress. Already we're seeing that might be shifting. At the beginning of December, he started to meet with some of the old political parties to try and acquire their support for his agenda. So really what we're going to see in the next 6 months to a year is whether or not the rhetoric is going to be matched with reality.
Yes. Now, just quickly, he's seen as the Trump of Latin America, isn't he? If President Trump should decline over the next 2 years, do Bolsonaro's fortunes go with the President Trump?
Well, that's one of the questions that's raised at the moment, because obviously he seems to be sort of riding internationally on the coattails of Trump. I mean, let's bear in mind, of course, that Bolsonaro's rise to power in Brazil, reflects to some extent some of the similar things that are going on across the world when it comes to populists. Duarte in the Philippines and Trump in the United States. There is a reaction, a resentment by the public towards sort of these out of touch political elites. But there are also distinct reasons why Bolsonaro got elected that are relevant to Brazil as well. Certainly, a lot of Bolsonaro's support came from the more educated, richer communities in Brazil, but he also has a base within amongst the poorer sections of Brazilian society, and much of that is also associated with the great degree of insecurity that they face on a day-to-day basis.
You wrote an article about what President Bolsonaro means for China-Brazil relations. What does he mean for China-Brazil relations?
Bolsonaro, during his campaign, was quite critical about China. He was very clear that his concern was that China was buying up Brazilian land and also potentially getting access into key public services, like the potential privatization of electricity there. So he was very keen that limits should be put on on China. However, what we've seen since the election is a little bit of a row back. One of his first meetings after being elected was with the Chinese ambassador. And that's really no surprise. I mean, we'd expect him to take a much more balanced approach, I think, internationally. Certainly, he will be supportive of Trump and the West, but the reality is that when it comes to Brazil's relationship with China, this is an incredibly important economic one. In 2017, it was around $75 billion worth of trade. And since 2003, China has invested close to 125 billion into Brazil. So it's not something that Brazil can afford to walk away lightly from.